During my husband's seventh-day memorial mass, my daughter-in-law whispered loudly, "At least the company now belongs to my husband." What the will revealed sent shivers down her spine. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." The church was filled with the scent of lilies. Too many lilies. I sat in the front pew, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to focus on Father Mitchell's words about George's life, about our 40 years of marriage. But all I could hear was that whisper. "At least the company is now my husband's, Nicole's." Words, so casually spoken to her sister during my husband's memorial service, sliced through me like a blade. I kept my eyes forward, my face a mask of dignified grief, even as my insides crumbled. George had been gone exactly 7 days, and already they were dividing his legacy. I glanced sideways at my son James, his arm wrapped protectively around Nicole's shoulders. Had he heard what she said? Did he share her eagerness to claim George's construction company? The business he had built from nothing, pouring his heart and soul into every contract, every building, every bridge? "Mom," James touched my arm as people began to rise. The service had ended. I hadn't even noticed. "Are you ready to greet the guests?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. As I stood, my legs felt hollow, like they might give way beneath me. 65. Years old, and suddenly I felt 90. People filed past me, business associates, cousins, neighbors, all murmuring the same practiced condolences. I accepted their hugs and handshakes on autopilot, my mind still replaying Nicole's whisper. Had she always been this way? This calculating? This cold? "Roseanne, I'm so sorry for your loss." Mary Peterson, George's assistant for 20 years, clasped my hands in hers. Her eyes were red-rimmed and sincere. He was a wonderful man. "Thank you, Mary," I managed, grateful for her genuine grief. "He thought the world of you." The reception line continued, faces blurring together. I noticed Nicole and James across the room, huddled with Henry Gladwell, George's business partner. Their heads were bent close, voices low. Nicole's hand rested on Henry's arm, her expression earnest and somber, but I saw the gleam in her eyes. Anticipation. Later, at the reception in our home, I retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment alone. The caterers had stepped outside for a break, and the silence was blessed relief. I gripped the counter, finally allowing myself to feel the weight of what I'd heard. "You okay, Mom?" My daughter Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "Just needed a minute," I said, trying to smile. Sarah had flown in from Seattle, leaving her 2 boys with her ex-husband. She'd always been perceptive, too perceptive sometimes. Nicole's being. "Nicole," she said, stepping closer. "You've noticed too?" Sarah snorted softly. "Hard not to. She's practically measuring the curtains in Dad's office." I turned away, busying myself with arranging cookies on a plate. "She thinks James will inherit the company," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And will he?" Sarah asked quietly. The truth was, I didn't know. George had always handled the business matters, the legal affairs. I'd trusted him completely, content to support from the sidelines while he built his empire. Why had I never asked about his succession plans? Why had I assumed there would be more time? "The lawyer's coming tomorrow," I said. "We'll know then." Sarah squeezed my arm. "Whatever happens, I'm here for you." As we rejoined the guests, I noticed Nicole watching me, her expression impossible to read. She approached, arms outstretched for an embrace that felt like a performance. "Roseanne, you're being so strong," she said, her voice honeyed with false concern. "Please let me know if there's anything James and I can do, anything at all." Over her shoulder, I caught James's eye. Was that guilt in his expression? Or just grief? My son had always been ambitious. eager to follow in his father's footsteps. But when had ambition turned to entitlement? That night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in George's study. His presence still filled the room. In the worn leather of his chair, the faint smell of his cologne, the organized chaos of his desk. I ran my fingers over his calendar, open to the week he died. Every day filled with appointments, plans, a future he wouldn't see. Tomorrow, the truth would be revealed. Tomorrow, I would discover if George had seen Nicole for who she truly was. If he had recognized the hunger in our son's eyes. I picked up the photograph on his desk, the two of us on our 40th anniversary, his arm around my waist, both of us laughing. What would you do, George? What would you tell me now, for the first time since his death? I allowed myself to cry. Truly cry. The sobs racking my body as the weight of both grief and betrayal crashed over me. I cried for the loss of my husband, for the coldness of my daughter-in-law, for the uncertainty that stretched before me. I cried until there were no tears left, until exhaustion settled into my bones. Then, wiping my eyes, I straightened my shoulders and looked again at George's face in the photograph. Something inside me hardened, a small kernel of determination taking root. Tomorrow would bring truth. And with truth would come decisions I never thought I'd have to make. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that George had always liked, drawing strength from the familiar fabric. By 10 o'clock, everyone had gathered in Richard Whitman's office, our longtime family lawyer, a man who had been George's friend for 30 years. Nicole arrived wearing black, elegant as always, her hand firmly clasped around James's. Sarah sat beside me, her quiet presence a comfort. George's brother Edward had flown in from Phoenix, his weathered face solemn. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, adjusting his glasses. "As you know, we're here to discuss the last will and testament of George William Stanford." I fixed my eyes on a point above Richard's head, a small watercolor of a sailing boat that looked like it had hung there since the 1980s. I couldn't bear to see the anticipation in Nicole's eyes. Richard cleared his throat and began reading. The formalities washed over me, legal jargon that meant little. Then, to my beloved wife, Roseanne Elizabeth Stanford, I leave all shares and controlling interest in Stanford Construction, along with all assets, properties, and holdings contained therein. The silence that followed was absolute. I felt Sarah stiffen beside me, her hand finding mine and squeezing hard. I couldn't process the words, couldn't make sense of them. There must be a mistake. James's voice broke through the silence, strangled and high. Dad always said I would take over the company. Richard looked at him over his glasses. There is no mistake, James. Your father was very clear about his wishes. I finally dared to look at Nicole. Her face had drained of color, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather armrest of her chair. When she noticed my gaze, her expression shifted, a forced smile appearing. "Roseanne, I'm sure this is overwhelming for you," she said, her voice syrupy. "Perhaps we should discuss how best to handle this transition. James has been preparing to take over for years." Richard cleared his throat again. "There's more. George left specific instructions and several private letters to be opened today. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in George's familiar scrawl. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. My dearest Rosie, if you're reading this, then I've left you far too soon. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for many things, but most of all for not preparing you better for what's to come. I know this decision may come as a shock to you. You never wanted to be involved in the business, and I respected that. But over the years, I've watched you. I've seen your quiet strength, your instincts about people, your unwavering moral compass. You have gifts that our son, for all his talents, does not possess. James is ambitious, like I was. but his ambition is not tempered with wisdom. And Nicole. I've seen how she looks at what we've built, not with pride or respect, but with hunger. 3 months ago, I discovered something troubling. Funds have been diverted from company accounts, small amounts at first, then larger sums. The trail leads to James and Nicole. They've been preparing for a takeover, Rosie, even before my diagnosis. I've included all the documentation with Richard. The choice of what to do with this information is yours. I trust you to make the right decision. You are stronger than you know, more capable than you believe. The company is yours now. Lead it with the same grace and integrity with which you've led our family. All my love, always. George. I folded the letter carefully, my mind reeling. George had known. He had seen through Nicole's charming facade, recognized our son's weaknesses. The knowledge was both vindicating and devastating. There are additional documents, Richard said quietly, sliding a folder toward me. Financial records, account statements, emails. George left strict instructions that these were to be reviewed privately with you. What other documents? James demanded, his face flushed. We have a right to know. Richard's expression hardened. Actually, you don't. Not at this point. Nicole's hand shot out, gripping James's arm in warning. Of course, she said smoothly. We understand this is a difficult time for everyone. Her eyes met mine, calculating, assessing. Perhaps, she continued. We should give Roseanne some time to process everything. Obviously, she'll want to transfer management responsibilities to James as soon as possible. Running a construction company is hardly something she's equipped for. The condescension in her voice ignited something in me, a slow-burning flame of indignation. Thank you for your concern, Nicole, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. But I think I'd like to take some time to consider all my options. Sarah's lips twitched with the hint of a smile. Edward cleared his throat. George knew what he was doing, he said, his gruff voice breaking the tension. Always did. James stood, abruptly. This is ridiculous. Dad was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. James, Richard's voice carried a warning. Your father was of sound mind when he made these decisions. I can assure you of that. Nicole tugged at James's sleeve. Let's go, she murmured. We'll discuss this at home. As they turned to leave, Nicole paused by my chair, leaning down as if to embrace me. This isn't over, she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. You have no idea what you're doing. When the door closed behind them, I let out a breath. I hadn't realized I was holding. Sarah's arm came around my shoulders. Mom, are you okay? I looked down at George's letter, then at the folder containing evidence of my son's betrayal. My heart felt like it was being torn in two. I don't know, I answered honestly. But I think I need to find out exactly what James and Nicole have been up to. Richard nodded grimly. George was very thorough in his investigation. You should prepare yourself, Roseanne. What you're about to learn won't be easy to hear. As I reached for the folder, I felt a strange calm settling over me. George had trusted me with this. He believed I was strong enough to handle it, to make the right decisions. For the first time in 40 years, I was on my own. But perhaps I wasn't as unprepared as I'd thought. The manila folder sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. Sarah had returned to Seattle, promising to come back soon. The house felt cavernous without George, every room haunted by memories. But the silence gave me time to think, to process, to plan. When I finally opened the folder, the contents stole my breath. Bank statements, transfer records, emails between James and Nicole dating back nearly 2 years. They had siphoned off nearly $300,000 from the company accounts, disguising the transactions as vendor payments and consultant fees. One email exchange made my hands shake with anger. Dad's asking questions about the Carson project expenses. Distract him. Tell him something about permits. He never checks those details. A. What if he finds out? N. He won't. And soon it won't matter anyway. The doctor said 6 months max. They had known about George's cancer, had counted on his illness to distract him, had calculated his death into their plans. I closed the folder, walked calmly to the bathroom, and vomited until there was nothing left but bitter bile. My own son. My own son had betrayed not just the company, but his dying father. That night, I made a decision. I called Catherine Zhao, a business consultant who had worked with George occasionally. We arranged to meet the following day. Mrs. Stanford, Catherine greeted me, her handshake firm and confident. I was sorry to hear about George. He was a good man. Thank you, I said. And please, call me Roseanne. Catherine was in her early 50s, her black hair streaked with silver, her dark eyes shrewd but kind. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation. The will, the evidence of James and Nicole's betrayal, my complete inexperience in running a construction company. So you're planning to sell? She asked when I finished. I don't. No, I admitted. Part of me wants to wash my hands of all of it. But George trusted me with this. He believed I could do it. Catherine studied me, her expression thoughtful. George and I spoke often about the company. He mentioned you more than you might think. I blinked in surprise. Me? He said you had an instinct for people, that you could spot a dishonest contractor from a mile away. She smiled slightly. He also said you kept the books for his first 3 projects, back when Stanford Construction was just him and a pickup truck. I hadn't thought about those early days in years, sitting at our tiny kitchen table, calculator in hand, checking George's math, suggesting ways to trim costs without sacrificing quality. That was a lifetime ago, I said softly. Maybe. But those skills don't disappear. Catherine leaned forward. What if, instead of selling, you learned? You have time. The company runs itself day to day. You could observe, ask questions, slowly take the reins. For the first time since George's death, I felt a flicker of something like hope. What about James? Catherine's expression turned serious. That's a separate issue. The evidence you have. That's embezzlement, Roseanne. It's criminal. I nodded, my chest tight. My son could go to jail. My grandchildren would grow up with their father behind bars. I need time, I said, to figure out what to do about James. But I want to learn about the company. Catherine nodded. We start tomorrow. The next few weeks passed in a blur of information. I spent mornings with Catherine, afternoons at the office. I introduced myself to employees, many of whom seemed surprised to see me. I reviewed projects, contracts, processes. I asked endless questions and absorbed every answer. James and Nicole, meanwhile, had shifted to a new strategy. James called daily, his tone conciliatory. Mom, I've been thinking about what happened, he said one evening. I was shocked, that's all. But I want to help you through this. Nicole and I both do. That's thoughtful of you, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. We should have dinner soon. The kids miss you. My heart squeezed painfully at the mention of my grandchildren, Lily and Marcus. I hadn't seen them since the memorial service. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. Dinner was set for Friday. I spent the day at the office, reviewing the Johnson contract with Trevor, our head estimator. When I pointed out a discrepancy in the materials cost estimate, he looked at me with new respect. You've got a good eye, Mrs. Stanford, he said. George always said you were the brains behind the operation. I smiled, touched by the comment. George exaggerated. I don't think so, ma'am, not anymore. I drove to James and Nicole's house that evening feeling more confident than I had in weeks. The door opened before I could knock, Lily and Marcus launching themselves at me. Grandma, we missed you. I hugged them tightly, inhaling the sweet scent of their hair, feeling their small arms around my neck. Nicole appeared in the doorway, perfectly coiffed as always, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Roseanne, come in. James is just opening some wine." The house was immaculate as usual. Nicole's decorating taste ran to sleek minimalism, all chrome and glass and white surfaces. Beautiful but cold, like Nicole herself. James embraced me, his familiar aftershave bringing a pang of nostalgia. He looked so much like George at that age, the same strong jaw, the same confident stance. But George's eyes had always been kind. "Mom, you look well," he said, handing me a glass of white wine. "I'm keeping busy," I replied. "At the company?" Nicole asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Among other things." As we settled at the dining table, I noticed how James and Nicole exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. The children chattered happily, oblivious to the undercurrents. "So," James said, cutting into his salmon, "have you given any thought to the future? Of the company, I mean." "Some," I answered, watching Nicole's perfectly manicured fingers tighten around her fork. "Because I've been thinking," he continued, "it makes sense for you to retain ownership, of course. But the day-to-day operations, that's a lot for anyone to take on, especially someone who's never been involved in the business. It would be a shame," Nicole added smoothly, "for George's legacy to suffer. He built something remarkable." "Yes," I agreed, meeting her gaze steadily. "He did." The dinner with James and Nicole repeated itself every Friday for the next month. Each time, the pattern was the same. Warm greetings, time with my grandchildren, then the inevitable, carefully worded suggestions that I step aside. "Let James take over. Sign the papers they had conveniently prepared." "It's for the best, Mom," James would say, his eyes earnest. "You deserve to enjoy your retirement, not worry about contracts and payroll." I would smile, deflect, change the subject. Each week I watched Nicole's polite mask slip a little further, frustration seeping through the cracks. Meanwhile, I continued my education. Catherine was a patient teacher, helping me understand not just the business, but the industry. I spent more time at the office, getting to know the employees, reviewing past projects. To my surprise, I found I had a knack for it, for spotting inefficiencies, for asking the right questions, for connecting with clients. "You're a natural," Catherine told me one afternoon as we reviewed quarterly projections. "George was right about you." The compliment warmed me, but I was under no illusions. James and Nicole were growing desperate. The polite requests would not continue indefinitely. My suspicions were confirmed when I received a call from Dr. Myers, our family physician. "Roseanne," he said, his voice concerned. "James came to see me yesterday. He's worried about you." Gripped the phone tighter. "Is that so?" "He thinks you might be suffering from depression, possibly the early stages of dementia. He asked me to recommend a geriatric specialist for an evaluation." Cold anger spread through my chest. "And what did you tell him?" "That I've seen no signs of cognitive decline in you whatsoever." But he was quite insistent. After thanking Dr. Myers, I sat at my kitchen table, hands shaking with fury. So this was their new strategy: declare me incompetent, take control of the company that way. That evening, I received a text from Nicole. "Roseanne, James and I are concerned about you. We've noticed some changes in your behavior. We've made an appointment with a specialist for next Tuesday. James will pick you up at 10. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Richard Whitman. "They're trying to have me declared incompetent," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. Richard sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this. George worried they might try something like this if things didn't go their way." "What can I do?" "Document everything. Every conversation, every text." "And Roseanne," his voice grew more serious, "be careful about what you eat or drink at their house." My blood ran cold. You don't think they would? Probably not, he cut in. But sedatives could make you appear confused, disoriented. It would support their claim. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought that my own son might drug me, might try to strip me of my dignity and autonomy, was almost too painful to bear. But beneath the pain, something else was growing. A fierce, protective anger, not just for myself, but for George's legacy, for the company he had built, for the employees who depended on it. The next morning, I made a decision. I would confront them, but on my terms, not theirs. I arranged a family dinner at my house for Sunday evening. I invited Sarah, who flew in from Seattle, and Edward, who agreed to drive up from Phoenix. I even called Nicole's parents, whom I had always liked despite their daughter's coldness. When everyone had arrived, seated around the dining table George and I had bought for our 10th anniversary, I took a deep breath and stood. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know some of you traveled far to be here." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Nicole's smile was fixed, her eyes darting between me and her parents. I wanted us all together because there are some matters that need to be addressed openly, as a family. I met James's gaze directly. "Son, would you like to tell everyone about your appointment with Dr. Myers? Or about the specialist you've scheduled for me on Tuesday?" James's face drained. Of color, Sarah gasped softly. "Mom, it's not like that," James stammered. "We're worried about you, that's all." "Worried," I repeated, "that I might continue to run the company George left to me. Worried that I might discover more about the funds you and Nicole have been diverting over the past 2 years." The room went deadly silent. Nicole's father, Robert, leaned forward, his expression grave. "What funds?" he asked. I had prepared for this moment, had copies of the evidence ready. As I distributed them around the table, Nicole stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "James, we don't have to sit here and listen to these wild accusations." "They're not accusations if I have proof," I replied calmly. "Bank statements, emails. George discovered what you were doing before he died. It's why he left the company to me, not to James." Nicole's mother, Ellen, was staring at the documents, her face ashen. "Nicole, is this true?" Nicole's composure finally shattered. "So, what if it is? We deserved that money. James has worked for that company for 15 years, and George never appreciated him, never gave him the recognition he deserved." "Nicole!" James warned, but she was too far gone. "She doesn't know anything about running a construction company," Nicole continued, gesturing wildly at me. "She's going to run it into the ground. We were trying to save it." "By stealing from it?" Edward's voice was quiet but cutting. "By securing our future," Nicole shot back. "James should have been named president years ago, but George always held on to control, always treated James like a child." James grabbed her arm. "That's enough, Nicole." But the damage was done. Nicole's parents were staring at their daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. Sarah's expression was a mixture of shock and disgust. Edward shook his head slowly. "James," I said, my voice gentle despite everything. "Why? Your father loved you. He was grooming you to take over eventually." James couldn't meet my eyes. "It was taking too long," he muttered. "And when Dad got sick, I thought he might sell rather than leave it to me." Nicole thought. We thought. "You thought you'd take matters into your own hands." I finished for him. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken pain and disappointment. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "What happens now, Roseanne?" It was the question I had been asking myself for weeks. The evidence in that folder could send my son to prison. It could tear apart our family even more than it already was. "That," I said, looking directly at James and Nicole, "depends on what happens next." Are you threatening us? Nicole's voice had turned hard, desperate. No, I replied. I'm offering you a choice. The silence that followed my statement seemed to stretch for an eternity. James stared down at his hands, shoulders slumped. Nicole's face was a mask of defiance, but I could see fear beneath it. What choice? James finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath. You can resign from Stanford Construction, both of you. You will repay every cent you've taken with interest. You will never attempt to interfere with the company again. I paused, steeling myself for the most difficult part. In return, I won't press charges. Nicole laughed, the sound brittle and harsh. You wouldn't send your own son to prison. You're bluffing. Nicole, her father warned quietly. I looked at my daughter-in-law, really looked at her. The perfect makeup, the designer clothes, the carefully maintained facade of superiority. For years, I had tried to win her approval, to be the mother-in-law she wanted. Now I realized how pointless that had been. You're right, Nicole. I don't want to send my son to prison. I turned to James. But I will if I have to. This isn't just about money. It's about trust. It's about the legacy your father built. It's about the people who depend on this company for their livelihoods. So that's it? James asked, his voice bitter. You're just cutting me out? After all the years I've given to the company? Sarah, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. James, you stole from Dad while he was dying. What did you expect? James flinched as if she had struck him. I'm not cutting you out entirely, I said. You can stay on as a consultant if you wish. You know the business, the clients. But you will have no access to financial accounts, no decision-making authority. And what about me? Nicole demanded. Your position as marketing director is terminated, effective immediately. Nicole stood so abruptly that her chair toppled backward. This is outrageous. James, we don't have to take this. She can't prove anything. James looked up at her, then at me, his expression torn. I saw the boy he had once been, eager to please, hungry for validation. What had happened to that child? When had he become this man, willing to betray his own father? Mom, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Give me another chance. Please. I'll make it right. For a moment, I wavered. This was my son, my firstborn. Despite everything, I loved him, James, I said gently. This is your second chance. I'm not sending you to jail. I'm not exposing what you did to the world. But I can't put you in a position to hurt the company again. Nicole grabbed her purse. This is ridiculous. We'll fight this. We'll get lawyers involved. You certainly could, Richard cut in smoothly. But the evidence is quite compelling, and embezzlement charges would be just the beginning. Nicole's parents exchanged glances. Ellen spoke up, her voice strained. Nicole, enough. You and James should consider Mrs. Stanford's offer very carefully. The evening ended shortly after, the atmosphere heavy with unresolved tension. Nicole stalked out without saying goodbye, James trailing behind her like a shadow. Sarah hugged me tightly before leaving for her hotel. I'm proud of you, Mom, she whispered. Dad would be too. That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt too big, I sat in George's study and wept. For the son I had raised, for the family that was fracturing, for the husband who wasn't there to help me through it. The next morning, reality set in. I had a company to run, employees who depended on me. I dressed carefully, choosing a blue suit that made me feel confident, and drove to the office. The news had spread quickly. As I walked through the building, I could feel eyes on me, could hear the whispers. James and Nicole had been popular, at least on the surface. I wondered how many people thought I was just a bitter widow, pushing out my own son out of spite. Catherine met me at my office. George's office, now mine. Are you ready for this? She asked. No, I admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. I spent the day in meetings with department heads, listening more than speaking, asking questions, taking notes. Some seemed skeptical of me, others guardedly optimistic. Trevor, the head estimator, was openly supportive. "Mrs. Stanford," he said as our meeting concluded, "for what it's worth, I think George made the right call. James is, well, let's just say he takes shortcuts. That doesn't work in construction." By the end of the week, I had met with every key employee, reviewed all ongoing projects, and begun to develop a plan for the company's future. With Catherine's help, I identified strengths to build on and weaknesses to address. Meanwhile, James had moved out his personal belongings from his office, but had not yet given me an answer about the consultant position. Nicole had been seen clearing out her desk late one night when the building was nearly empty. Friday evening, as I was preparing to leave, my phone rang. It was Ellen, Nicole's mother. "Roseanne," she began, her voice hesitant, "I owe you an apology. Robert and we had no idea what Nicole was involved in." "I know," I said, meaning it. Ellen and Robert were good people. They had always treated me with kindness. "We've spoken with them," she continued. "Extensively, I think. I think James might be ready to accept your offer. But Nicole..." I sighed, understanding what she wasn't saying. Nicole was the driving force, had always been. She had pushed James, molded him, used his insecurities to her advantage. "Ellen, I appreciate you reaching out. But this is between James and me now. He needs to make his own decision." As if on cue, a text came through from James. "Can we talk tomorrow?" Alone. I stared at the message, hope and wariness battling within me. Was this the first step toward reconciliation, or another manipulation? The next morning, I met James at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory for both of us. He looked tired, the circles under his eyes pronounced. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said after we'd ordered coffee. "I want to accept it." "And Nicole?" He grimaced. "She's not happy. She thinks we should fight you." "But..." He hesitated. "I've been looking at what would happen if this went public. My career would be over. No one would hire me." It wasn't remorse, not yet. But it was a start. "And the money?" "We'll pay it back," he said. "All of it. It might take time, but we'll do it." I studied my son's face, looking for sincerity, for understanding of the damage he had caused. I saw exhaustion, resignation, perhaps a flicker of shame. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. But it was a beginning. "All right," I said. "We'll draw up an agreement. You'll work as a consultant, 3 days a week. You'll report directly to me." He nodded, his relief palpable. "Thank you, Mom." As we parted ways, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. But we had taken the first step. 2 years can change everything. I stood at the window of my office, no longer George's office, but truly mine, looking out at the Stanford construction yard below. Workers moved with purpose between buildings. Delivery trucks came and went, the steady rhythm of a thriving business. "Mrs. Stanford?" My assistant, Melanie, appeared in the doorway. "The birthday cake is ready whenever you are." I smiled, glancing at the clock. "Let's give it another 10 minutes. Sarah's flight might be running late." "Of course." And Mr. Edwards called to confirm the contract signing for tomorrow. "Thank you, Melanie." Alone again, I ran my hand over the smooth surface of my desk. In the corner sat a photograph of George, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way they always did when he smiled. Next to it, a newer addition. A picture. From the company picnic last summer, me surrounded by employees, looking more confident than I'd ever been in my life. At 67, I had never expected to be running a construction company. Had never imagined I would be good at it. But here I was, Not just surviving, but thriving. Under my leadership, Stanford Construction had expanded into 3 new markets, increased profitability by 20%, and maintained the reputation for quality that George had established. The journey hadn't been easy. Those first months were a steep learning curve, filled with mistakes and moments of self-doubt. There were nights I sat alone in this office, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility, wondering if I was destroying everything George had built. But slowly, decision by decision, I had found my footing. I discovered that my people instincts, as George had called them, were a valuable asset in business. I could read a room, sense when someone was being dishonest, know when to push and when to yield. The door opened again, and Sarah peeked in, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Mom! Sorry I'm late. Traffic from the airport was brutal." I embraced her, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "You're right on time. How are the boys?" "Growing too fast. Ethan made the soccer team, and Jake is obsessed with dinosaurs. They're sad they couldn't come with me this time." "Well, I'll be visiting next month for Jake's birthday," I reminded her. "Now, are you ready for this little party? The whole office is waiting." Sarah linked her arm through mine. "Lead the way, CEO." The conference room was packed with employees, a chorus of "Happy Birthday" erupting as I entered. Trevor from estimating, now my right-hand man, stood beside an enormous cake decorated with tiny construction equipment. Melanie had arranged for catering, and the long table was laden with food. As I made my way through the room, accepting well wishes and hugs, I caught sight of James standing awkwardly by the window. Our eyes met, and he offered a tentative smile. Our relationship had been a work in progress over the past 2 years. The consultant position had evolved into a project manager role, with strict oversight. James had proven himself capable, if not exceptional, and more importantly, he had stayed clean. No more financial improprieties, no more shortcuts. Nicole was another story. 6 months after our confrontation, she had filed for divorce, citing James's failure to stand up for himself as the reason. She had moved to Phoenix, taking the children with her. James saw them every other weekend, flying out on Friday evenings and returning Sunday nights. The divorce had been a turning point for James. Without Nicole's influence, he had slowly begun to find himself again. He wasn't the man his father had been, would never be the natural leader George was, but he had other qualities, a keen eye for design, a good rapport with clients. "Happy birthday, Mom," he said, handing me a small wrapped package. I opened it carefully. Inside was a silver picture frame containing a black and white photograph I hadn't seen in years. George and me on the day we broke ground on our first major project, both of us laughing, covered in dirt from the ceremonial shovel. "I found it when I was going through some old files," James explained. "Thought you might like to have it." "I love it," I said truthfully, touching the image of George's smiling face. "Thank you, James." After cake and speeches, as the party began to wind down, Sarah pulled me aside. "So," she said, her voice low, "have you given any more thought to Richard's suggestion?" Richard Whitman had introduced me to his friend Alan 6 months ago. Alan was a widower, a retired architect who had worked with George occasionally over the years. We had been seeing each other casually, dinners, theater, comfortable companionship. I admitted. Alan asked me to go to Italy with him. For 3 weeks, in September. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "And? Are you going?" "I think I am," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "The company can run without me for a few weeks. I've earned a vacation." Sarah hugged me fiercely. "You absolutely have. Dad would want you to be happy, you know." Later that evening, Sarah and I sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was warm, fragrant with the roses George had planted years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Taking over the company instead of just selling it? It would have been easier." I considered the question, thinking of the long hours, the steep learning curve, the weight of responsibility. Then I thought of the satisfaction of a project completed on time and under budget, the pride in seeing a building rise from nothing, knowing I had played a part in its creation. The respect I had earned not as George's widow but as a business leader in my own right. No, I said finally. No regrets. It hasn't been easy, but it's been right. For me, for the employees, for George's legacy. And for James? I glanced at the photograph he had given me, now sitting on the side table. For James, too, I think. He needed to learn that there are consequences to his actions. He needed to earn his place rather than feel entitled to it. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You know, when Dad died, I was so worried about you. You seemed so lost. I was, I admitted. I didn't know who I was without him. I'd been George's wife for so long, I'd forgotten how to be just Roseanne. And now? I smiled, feeling the warm evening breeze against my face. Now I know exactly who I am. The company holiday party that December was held at the Grand Hotel downtown, a celebration of Stanford Construction's most profitable year to date. I stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of employees, clients, and friends. 27 months ago, I knew almost nothing about running a construction company, I began, but George did. He knew that this company wasn't just about buildings, it was about people, about integrity, about doing things right, even when no one is watching. I paused, my gaze finding James in the crowd. He nodded slightly, understanding. In his eyes, Stanford Construction will continue to grow and evolve. We'll face challenges and opportunities, but our foundation, the values that George Stanford built this company on, those will never change. As applause filled the room, I felt a sense of completion, of things coming full circle. Nicole had been wrong that day at the memorial service. The company wasn't her husband's. It wasn't even mine. Not really. It belonged to all of us who had built it, brick by brick, day by day. It belonged to George's memory and to the future we would create together. And as for me, the woman who had once been just George's wife, I had found something I never expected. Not just purpose, not just confidence, but joy. The joy of discovery, of challenge, of becoming more than I had ever thought possible. George had given me one final gift. Not the company itself, but the opportunity to discover my own strength. And for that, I would be forever grateful.